Every organism on Earth requires energy to grow and function. Animals get their energy from food, which is broken down by digestion and distributed to the cells in their bodies. Plants create their own food by absorbing water, carbon dioxide, minerals, and sunlight. Organisms extract energy from food and store it through a series of chemical reactions. These reactions occur at a molecular level inside cells. Thousands of chemical reactions take place in a cell every second. Like microscopic power plants, cells provide the energy needed to sustain life. But organisms are constantly losing energy, and if an organism loses too much, it will die. Plants, animals, and microorganisms consume or produce food to make up for this loss. But why do organisms lose energy, and where does it go? The total amount of energy in the universe remains constant, but it can be converted into different forms. And whenever energy is converted from one form to another, some of it is turned into heat. A car engine converts the energy in gasoline into mechanical energy. Engines produce a large amount of heat because they are converting energy. Only about 35% of the energy in gasoline is turned into mechanical energy to move a car. The rest is lost as heat. Cells produce heat energy in a similar way. Reactions in cells produce heat when they convert energy. That heat energy eventually leaves the organism. Energy flows through the cells of organisms in millions of chemical reactions. During these reactions, complex molecules are broken down into simpler molecules, and simple ones are built up into more complex molecules. Every chemical reaction transfers energy between molecules. Exergonic reactions release energy by breaking down the chemical bonds of complex molecules, while endergonic reactions consume energy to build complex molecules from simpler ones. Exergonic reactions take place in our muscles whenever we move. They contract when they receive energy, and the contractions trigger movement. Our bodies need more energy during strenuous physical activity. Cells compensate by increasing the number of exergonic reactions. As the exergonic reactions increase, more heat is produced. Heat is always a byproduct of an energy reaction, whether in a car engine or a muscle. Endergonic reactions form the molecules that build up to comprise an organism. All the tissues and organs in our bodies are formed by endergonic reactions. Healing is also an endergonic process. Energy is consumed when new tissues form to replace damaged ones. Exergonic reactions release energy, and endergonic reactions consume energy. The two are part of a coordinated energy flow where some of the energy released during one fuels the other. Catalysts coordinate the flow of energy between exergonic and endergonic reactions. The catalysts in cells are proteins called enzymes. Molecules involved in the reactions are substrates. Enzymes catalyze exergonic and endergonic reactions. During a catalytic reaction, a substrate fits into a groove on the surface of an enzyme called an active site. The active site reorients the substrates. Reorienting the molecules reduces the amount of energy needed to activate the reaction. Each cell contains thousands of different enzymes, and each one has a specific substrate that it can catalyze. A catalytic process does not destroy or use up enzymes. After the reaction is completed, enzymes are reused with new substrates. The amount of energy an organism needs depends on its level of activity. Running requires more energy than walking. Cells have a way of transferring energy and releasing it when it is needed. Energy is transferred in the molecule adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP contains 3 phosphate groups held together by high-energy bonds. The phosphate bonds can be broken apart very easily. When they are broken, they release large amounts of energy. When enzymes catalyze an endergonic reaction, simple molecules are chemically joined to create a more complex molecule. ATP supplies the energy required to drive the reaction. ATP releases energy when the high-energy bonds between the phosphate groups break down. The end phosphate group of ATP breaks off, releasing a large amount of energy for the endergonic reaction. This leaves adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, and a phosphate molecule. An exergonic reaction breaks the chemical bonds of a substrate, which releases energy. An ADP molecule captures the energy and uses it to bond with a phosphate group, making a new molecule of ATP. Cells always have a supply of ATP, ADP, and phosphate groups for energy reactions. This is how cells transfer and release energy that organisms need to live. Thanks to ATP and chemical reactions, we have enough energy to get through the day. Did you know? Enzymes are crucial for the functioning of organisms, but they also have industrial and medical applications. They catalyze the reactions that leaven bread and curdle cheese. Enzymes also promote healing and can help doctors diagnose some diseases.
Plants and animals break down food to replenish their energy supply. A series of complicated reactions freeze the energy contained in food for use in the rest of the organism. Organisms require food to replenish their energy. Some can produce their own food. They are called autotrophs, or self-feeders. They create food using the process of photosynthesis. Plants are autotrophs, as are many microorganisms. Organisms that cannot photosynthesize are called heterotrophs. They consume either plants or other animals as food. Humans are heterotrophs and must ingest food as their source of energy. All life depends on a steady supply of energy. Its primary source of energy is sunlight, which is captured by autotrophs during photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a complicated chemical process that harvests the energy of sunlight. Light provides the energy to convert water and carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen. Glucose is a simple sugar plants use as food. Photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts, which are mostly in the cells of plant leaves. Inside the chloroplasts are flattened sacs called thylakoids. In the membranes of the thylakoids are photocenters, or clusters of chlorophyll molecules. Arrays of photocenters absorb the light needed for photosynthesis. For every 4 photons of light absorbed by a chlorophyll molecule in a photocenter, 4 electrons in the chlorophyll are boosted to an excited state, and they leave the molecule. To replace these missing electrons, 2 molecules of water are broken apart. This produces 4 hydrogen atoms and 1 molecule of oxygen, which is released into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis produces almost all the oxygen in our atmosphere. The 4 energized electrons from the chlorophyll pass through a system of molecules called an electron transport chain. As electrons flow along the chain, energy is released and captured by enzymes, which convert ADP to ATP. Coenzymes such as NADP+ act as electron carriers to assist the synthesis of ATP. Then ATP is used for the next step of photosynthesis. The next part of the process is the Calvin-Benson cycle. It is carried out by enzymes located in chloroplasts and doesn't require any light. The ATP generated in the first part of photosynthesis is used to build molecules of glucose from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Glucose is the final product of photosynthesis. Plants use some of it for their own energy needs and store the rest. When herbivores eat plants, they consume the glucose stored in the plant's cells. By breaking down this glucose, herbivores convert ADP to ATP. This gives them the energy they need to survive. Even carnivores that never eat plants need photosynthesis indirectly because they eat animals that have eaten plants. All animals are dependent on photosynthesis for their source of energy. Plants and animals break down their food to release energy and capture it in molecules of ATP. Cellular respiration is the process that releases the energy stored in food. Cellular respiration starts with the process of glycolysis, which breaks down a molecule of glucose. Glycolysis yields one pair of 3 carbon molecules, called pyruvate, as well as 2 molecules of ATP. The next 3 stages in cellular respiration are pyruvate oxidation, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. These stages take place in mitochondria, the organelles inside plant and animal cells. The pyruvate molecules produced by glycolysis are broken down by oxidation into acetyl coenzyme A. This is the raw material for the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. This cycle is a series of reactions that produces 1 ATP for each molecule of acetyl coenzyme A and releases many electrons, which are carried to the next phase. The third stage is the electron transport chain. Chemical reactions and processes taking place along the chain produce an additional 32 to 34 molecules of ATP. The energy contained in ATP is distributed to every cell in the organism, where it powers the reactions necessary for life. Did you know mitochondria contain DNA that is separate from the rest of the cell? The DNA also resembles that of early single-celled organisms. This suggests that mitochondria might have originally been a separate, single-celled species. Many scientists believe the mitochondria were engulfed by larger cells and became organelles.
An organism needs food for energy, but types of food can be broken down into different molecules. The availability of food is limited by the total amount of energy available. Food supplies energy to all life processes. Photosynthesis allows autotrophs to produce their own food as glucose. But heterotrophs must consume their food in a mixture of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. They are more complex forms of food and must be digested to supply ATP to the cells. A heterotroph's digestive process breaks down large, complicated molecules into simpler ones. In human digestion, the intestines absorb the broken down molecules, which are then distributed to the rest of the body. Carbohydrates, found in pasta, bread, and fruit, are broken down into glucose. The glucose goes through the process of glycolysis and cellular respiration before its energy is transferred to ATP. Proteins in meats, dairy products, and nuts are first broken down into amino acids. Some molecules are converted into protein building blocks and nitrogen needed by animals. Other molecules enter directly into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, avoiding the glycolysis stage. Lipids, found in oils and cheeses, are split into fatty acids and glycerol. Some of the energy from fatty acids enters into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to form ATP. The chemical reactions in cells that change energy from one form to another also transform matter. The processes that alter matter and energy in an organism are referred to as its metabolism. Chains of the reactions of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are called metabolic pathways. Genes, or segments of DNA, organize the metabolic pathways in plants and animals. Genes direct the production of proteins that regulate the chemical reactions and ensure that energy is dispersed through the metabolic pathways to the cells that need it. Genes are located in the nuclei of cells. From there, they organize the production of proteins, such as enzymes. Enzyme production can be increased or decreased to account for varying levels of substrates. These organizational processes are fundamental to maintaining the energy of the organism. All living things require a constant input of energy from their environment. The primary source of energy is the sun. Trees and other organisms that photosynthesize convert light energy into chemical energy. Photosynthesis introduces new energy to all the organisms of an ecosystem. Herbivores consume plants to gain glucose, which is their source of food energy. Carnivores consume other animals to obtain the energy within their cells. When an organism dies, it becomes food for other organisms. This process recycles energy in the cells of the dead organism. But some energy is always lost in the process. Heat is produced whenever matter and energy are transformed. Organisms emit heat as they extract energy from food, which means they are always losing energy. Sunlight brings new, usable energy into the life cycle by way of photosynthesis. As long as the sun continues to produce light, life will have the supply of energy it needs to continue. Did you know? The energy consumed by humans is measured in kilocalories, which are usually referred to as calories. A human needs between 2,000 and 4,000 calories a day to sustain energy. 1 gram of fat produces 9 calories, and 1 gram of carbohydrates produces 4.
Your body makes sure that you eat by making you hungry. But chewing and swallowing is just the beginning of the digestive process. A fact you can become all too aware of sometimes. When you take your first bite of food, a complex process called digestion begins. What is digestion? Digestion occurs when your body breaks food down so that nutrients can be absorbed. When you eat something, your front teeth cut large pieces of food into chewable portions, while the teeth at the back of your mouth grind it down even further. After a few moments of chewing, an order of fries or a delicious slice of pizza mixes with saliva. An enzyme in the saliva reacts chemically with the starches in the food to turn them into a mushy mass you wouldn't even recognize as food. The chewing process is the first step in the digestive process. It's called mechanical digestion. It only takes one swallow, and the food that you've just eaten continues through a highly efficient machine known as the digestive system. The next stop is a long mucus-lined tube called the esophagus. Here, contractions of smooth muscle push food downward into the stomach. All of those contractions push the food through the esophagus and into the stomach, where another form of digestion takes place. Chemicals in saliva begin breaking down the carbohydrates in your food as soon as you put it in your mouth. Once food is inside your stomach, layers of muscle expand and contract, mixing your food with additional digestive fluids. This is called chemical digestion. These digestive fluids are produced in the stomach's lining. They begin the process of breaking down proteins in our food to even smaller particles that can be absorbed into the bloodstream. These stomach chemicals would digest the stomach itself if it were not lined with a thick layer of protective mucus. When everything has been churned to a consistence of soft cottage cheese, called chyme, the stomach starts expanding and contracting again, pushing tiny particles of partially digested food out of the stomach. The story doesn't end there. In order to be completely digested, food has to travel a distance of 19 feet, almost the length of a car, through the small intestine. How does the small intestine affect digestion? The first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, is an area where many digestive enzymes are added to it from the pancreas. These enzymes play the major role in the actual digestive process. Everything except some water and indigestible materials, such as fiber, are absorbed into the bloodstream from the small intestines. These indigestible materials and some water are moved through the small intestine and into the large intestine. The large intestine is the last stop food makes in its path through the digestive system. Waste matter, like fiber, collect in the large intestine until it is ready to be passed out or excreted through the anus. When waste matter is released, the body is free to digest any new material that comes through and start the whole process over again. Digestion isn't a simple thing. Sometimes it takes days to complete, but understanding how we digest the foods we love to eat helps us see how complex the human body is.
It has often been said that you are what you eat. Back in the days of bobby socks and varsity sweaters, the local diner was more than just a restaurant. It was a way of life. These days, paleontologists believe that when dinosaurs stepped out for a bite to eat, they told us all about themselves as well.
Primordial soup, please.
It is a story married in the daily operations of a joint like the Dino Diner. Dinosaurs had very definite eating habits, from strict vegetarians to meat eaters. And like any huge machine, they needed enormous amounts of fuel. In fact, all the food served at the Dino Diner in a day may not equal the size of one portion when a hungry sauropod sat down to lunch.
There you go.
Thanks.
Enjoy, ma'am.
Jim Farlow at Indiana University is a dino food expert, and he has worked out how much food the sauropod, the biggest dinosaur of them all, would have needed to eat to keep its huge body stoked with fuel.
Well, we know how much animals of various sizes today eat, and so we can get some calculations of how much you would expect an animal to eat for a given size, if it's either warm-blooded or cold-blooded. And for a 70-ton sauropod, if it were warm-blooded, it'd eat a couple million kilojoules a day. Okay, you don't know what that is. Well, it's about that much hay.
Mm. 17 bales of hay are more than a lot of creatures eat in a month. But if sauropods were warm-blooded, that amount is the minimum they would have needed. And because Jim knows that sauropods do not have any food as nutritious as hay, he has calculated a warm-blooded creature would have spent at least 22 hours of every day eating.
And that doesn't leave much time for other activities like sleeping or making baby sauropods. So I don't think they were warm-blooded. I think it more likely that they were cold-blooded. And based on what we see in cold-blooded animals today, we can estimate that the amount of food a 70-ton sauropod would need if cold-blooded would be about that much. 6 bales of hay.
Where did sauropods get their groceries? Some paleontologists think their long necks allowed them to frequent the most out-of-the-way of ancient eating establishments, the treetops. But is that how they ate?
We're 50, 60 feet off the ground and well within the range of the neck of a really big sauropod. The argument has been that maybe the heart wouldn't have been strong enough to pump the blood up to the brain when the neck is way up high. The problem then would have been if there's not enough blood to the brain, the animal might have fainted, and for a 70-ton animal to faint and hit the ground would be not very good. So a lot of people argue that maybe they used their necks horizontally and fed close to the ground, like a gigantic vacuum cleaner. And they may well have done that, but I suspect that they did a little bit of both.
By frequenting the street level and high-rise supermarkets of the day, sauropods found the key to supporting the largest bodies the world has ever known. Even so, they would have needed an enormous area to feed in.
I would guess that a cold-blooded 70-ton sauropod, if you were putting it on really good pasture land like we have here in Indiana today, you might have needed something like 25 acres to support it.
And yet, we know the quality of merchandise back then was not nearly as nutritious as modern-day produce. So each sauropod may have needed more than 250 acres to satisfy its appetite.
So you can kind of visualize them as gigantic multi-ton locusts moving over the landscape, stripping it clean, and then moving on to feed elsewhere.
There you go.
But for confirmed vegetarians, feeding on relatively non-nutritious plants just did not provide the kind of energy a growing creature needs, unless it eats an awful lot. Meat eaters had it a little easier. With each bite chock full of nutrition, they did not have to eat as much or as often.
Right now, I'm rather glad I'm not a plant. There's plenty, no rushing here. An herbivore like these cattle is going after a lot of spread out, dispersed, not in themselves very nutritious kinds of food. A carnivore on the other, easy, watch the foot. A carnivore, on the other hand, is going after big packets of food that is of very high quality, a lot of protein content, a lot of energy content. This guy, for example, looks delicious.
Because high-energy meat meals were much harder to find and catch, there were far fewer carnivores. But at least they did not need to go for food as often.
If a Tyrannosaurus were lucky enough to kill a Triceratops, it would get to feed on an animal about the same size as it is. It would probably gorge itself, guts flying everywhere, bones crunching, the big teeth ripping out the flesh. Your worst nightmare. It would probably eat close to its own body weight, I would guess. And then, if it were cold-blooded, it doesn't have to eat anything for a very long time. That single meal might last it months, perhaps even an entire year before it'd have to go looking for food again.
But if you are not as big as a T-Rex, then you cannot wolf down a whole year's worth of food in one sitting.
And then, is he gonna stay the night?
Smaller meat-eating dinosaurs had to have a really different food shopping strategy. The vicious Deinonychus had eyes too big for its stomach. Too small by itself to catch big meals it craved, they preferred dining in a communal setting. Lacking the teeth to tear through tough flesh, Deinonychus used a much more lethal utensil, a spring-loaded retractable claw that would carve so deep into even the largest sauropods, whose stomachs would fall out. So even the largest dinosaurs of all were vulnerable to smaller predators that attacked in packs. The best chefs often search long and hard for seasonal and difficult-to-find delicacies. In the dinosaur world, you had to be prepared to go out on your own and resort to any means to find your favorite meal.
Wait.
One Bronto burger, one curly fries.
Back in the kitchen, the chef toasts, fries, and chops, preparing the raw ingredients to cook. A couple 100 million years ago, dinosaurs had their own means of preparing meals to their liking. In his laboratory at the University of California, scientist Greg Erickson believes he has discovered how one predator prepared his favorite dish. Greg began with the leftovers from a prehistoric meal, a giant mauled bone, but experimented using a modern bone with similar properties.
Looks pretty good. Let's go with it.
The bone originally belonged to a Triceratops, a 7-ton creature with deadly horns and heavy armor. The mauled section was from the formidable pelvis of this tank-like creature. It had obviously been through more than one battle. Its final fight clearly was a losing effort.
When I first saw the pelvis, it had all kinds of punctures and gouges in it. We counted about 60 bite marks in it, and there's about 20 others that are probable bite marks, but they kind of overlie one another. There were some punctures that were about 3.5 inches in depth. There were cut marks that were about 8 inches in length. So it basically looked like a giant dog had been gnawing on this huge bone and kind of really worked it over.
Greg had to identify who made the bite marks. A large crocodile was a strong possibility. But Greg had a hunch the marks belonged to the largest carnivore that ever lived, Tyrannosaurus rex. In Indonesia today, the fearsome Komodo dragon uses a similar technique, clamping down with its teeth, then levering its lunch into the air, tearing it apart. But for Greg to be certain that T-Rex had been gnawing on the Triceratops bone, he had to make a copy of the bite mark.
What we did is we took dental putty. This is the sort of putty your dentist uses to make casts of your teeth. And we took a big wad of this and we pushed it down into one of the deeper puncture marks. And when we pulled it out, it came out looking very similar to an actual adult Tyrannosaurus rex tooth.
Now that Greg knew the chef, the next step was figuring out how the dish was prepared. He placed a bronze cast of the T-Rex tooth on a hydraulic loading frame. When the loading pressure was increased to create bite marks that matched those on the Triceratops pelvis, Greg knew he had effectively simulated the bite force of a T-Rex.
Well, it's hard to fathom the magnitude of the forces involved here as this tooth is punching through these bones. It's almost like a hot knife cutting through butter. It certainly convinced me at that point that T-Rex was quite a mean, rough fellow.
Greg calculated the bite force at 3,000 pounds per square inch. It meant a T-Rex had the bite strength to devour creatures its own size, even a 7-ton Triceratops.
What is 3,000 pounds equal to? Well, it'd be like, say, if you took this tooth, were to set it on top of yourself, let's say, and set a pickup truck on top of the tooth then, you imagine it would punch quite a hole in you. So it was quite a large amount of force. I think certainly it could open its mouth 2.5 feet. I expect they could take a pretty good chunk of meat out of whatever they bit into, maybe 50, 75 pounds of flesh, about equivalent to maybe a hind quarter of a cow today. I think you could probably stuff in there pretty reasonably without too much trouble.
Greg's study has proved the teeth of a T-Rex could withstand the stresses of biting into struggling prey, and Greg thinks this sheds some light on an age-old mystery. Was it merely a scavenger of dead dinosaurs, or was it the biggest, baddest fighter of all time?
Well, sometimes I wonder how strongly other scientists believe that this animal actually was a scavenger. I mean, if you were to say, put all of us that believe that T-Rex was a predator and all of us that believe that it was a scavenger and put us all out, say, on a football field and put a Tyrannosaur at one end of that football field, I'd be willing to bet there wouldn't be too many scientists standing in the middle of the field when that Tyrannosaur started rambling towards the midfield. I know that I would probably be one of the first people heading out the stadium tunnel.
So based on how a T-Rex ate, paleontologists have concluded it was probably agile and fast. The dagger-like horns of a Triceratops were a dangerous defense. To survive, the T-Rex must have used stealth and a final rapid dash to avoid a serious encounter with one of those deadly horns. But at times, T-Rex must have met its match. Carnivorous dinosaurs, sometimes called carnosaurs, became more efficient at the end of the Cretaceous and forced out all other predators. Phil Currie of Canada's Royal Tyrrell Museum believes these evolutionary changes were beginning to snowball.
But towards the end, during the Cretaceous, we're seeing an acceleration in diversification and greater changes taking place. So it appears that things were evolving very slowly initially, but towards the end of their reign on the Earth as the king dinosaurs, or the top carnivores, they were diversifying much more rapidly and changing much more rapidly.
Whether hunting alone or in groups, these massive carnivores were deadly. They would rush in at tremendous speed, scoop out a huge hunk of flesh, then leap back and wait for their prey to bleed to death, risk-free and very effective. Based on the habits of modern predators, the carnosaurs probably hunted at dawn or dusk, or on moonlit nights. They may have only eaten once a week or even every other week, but when they ate, it might have been 1,000 pounds at a sitting. In North America, Albertosaurus and Tyrannosaurus took two evolutionary courses. Tyrannosaurus took the fast track and became larger and stronger. Albertosaurus remained the same size. It was quicker than T-Rex, but not as big. As Albertosaurus and other carnosaurs evolved their fast, long legs and large meat-scooping jaws, all else was pared away. Their arms and shoulders grew smaller, no bigger than man's.
The reason they developed the short arms is to reduce the amount of weight in front of the hips. As you get bigger, you end up having more mass in front of the hips, and if you're a big meat-eating dinosaur, you suffer the possibility that you're going to fall on your face if you have too much weight up front. So what these animals did was reduce the weight as much as possible. Regardless of the fact that they're very short arms, they are nevertheless quite powerful. And one would assume that these animals were in fact grasping their prey, holding on to them while the jaws did their dirty work.
We know how carnosaurs were built, but what did they really look like? Some speculate they had lizard-like skin, and others suggest they were more like birds and perhaps even had feathers. Now, Jose Bonaparte has found the first direct evidence, a skin impression from a carnosaur.
This is interesting because some paleontologists suppose that the carnivorous dinosaurs, they had some feathers, but we have discovered not the slight indication of feather in the skin impression.
Reconstructing the shape of a dinosaur's head is fairly easy. The heads were mostly skin and bones, so the shape closely matches that of the skull. The body is more difficult. The skeleton is a clue to its size and bulk. Probably the most difficult question is, what color were they? The small predators were probably camouflaged with stripes and spots. But camouflage wouldn't make much difference to a 20-foot tall killer. So the biggest carnosaurs were most likely a dull green or gray. Based on the size of their brain cases, the last of the carnosaurs had added a new feature to their already impressive arsenal of weapons: intelligence. It is a characteristic of all pack-hunting animals.
I think that you need a relatively high degree of intelligence to work as a coordinated group, as a packing animal. And it's not surprising that most of the most intelligent animals today are in fact some of the more intelligent animals that we're aware of. So it's not surprising that amongst the dinosaurs, the ones that we think are packing animals are the ones with the largest brains.
The later carnosaurs' eyes looked forward, giving them depth perception, thus allowing them to strike more accurately. And they had a highly directional sense of hearing. At the time of the great dinosaur extinction, 65 million years ago, the great carnivores were rapidly diversifying and becoming increasingly sophisticated. When humans overindulge, we can resort to an array of pills and potions. Dinosaurs had their own remedies for a bad case of indigestion. Whether haute cuisine or a simple salad bar, cooking is the art of combining the ingredients to one's liking. Dinosaurs had their own internal food processors to extract the nourishment they needed. Peter Dodson, a paleontologist at the University of Pennsylvania, loves a big meal, and he is fascinated with the mechanics of digestion in the really big eaters of the dinosaur world.
How did they get it all down? Well, if they ate very succulent foods like these grapes, which I'm stomping on, grapes are very easy to crush and release the nutrition. But there were no grapes back in the sauropods' day, and very few succulent foods. They had to eat very tough, fibrous foods. How did they deal with this?
Sauropods had terrible table manners, often swallowing their food whole. But that meant it had to be broken down in their stomachs. And because much of the food was tough, leafy tissue with very little nutrition, they had to eat prodigious amounts. Here again, eating habits are a window into the dinosaurs' world.
Their ability to process plant food was rather limited. This suggests that the energy flow, their energy budgets were rather modest. And these very same dinosaurs, sauropods, stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, had the smallest brains of all dinosaurs. So this suggests that their overall lifestyle was a rather slow pace. These were the Model T Fords of the dinosaur world.
Dinosaurs that swallowed large amounts of whole or hard-to-digest foods had to work overtime simply to extract what little nutrition the food possessed. How they actually did that was a mystery until recently discovered fossils revealed that dinosaurs, presumably as a sort of aperitif, swallowed stones to help their digestion.
Sauropods were eating fibrous leaf material, and by themselves, leaves are hard to digest. The stomach is a very muscular organ, so as the stomach churned a great mass of stones rubbed against each other, and they rubbed against the plant material too. And as they tumbled, the plant material was nicely broken up into small fragments, which are much more easily digested.
But stones were only the beginning. Dinosaurs relied on microbes in their stomachs to aid digestion and break down their food into a form they could easily convert to energy.
A 70-ton sauropod dinosaur is an enormous animal, and the size of its fermentation vat would have been staggering. We reckon it was somewhere around 10 tons. That would have been equivalent to 30 barrels of wine. 30 barrels.
But like anyone who overindulges, a 10-ton fermentation vat for a stomach would have produced, let us say, side effects.
Fermentation is a chemical process which produces large quantities of gas. And our giant sauropod was fermenting 10 tons of plant material. It must have produced prodigious quantities of gas. In a word, it produced wind.
What people eat can tell a lot about them. The interesting part for some begins when the eating is finished. After all is said and done and eaten, restaurants, like creatures, must relieve themselves of unwanted leftovers. To one scientist, even that can tell us a lot about how dinosaurs lived. Karen Chin of the University of Santa Barbara is a connoisseur of dinosaur dung. Produced in the days before scooping laws, there is a lot to be found, if you know what to look for. And yet, it is not a field everyone finds very appealing.
Actually, when you first start looking at dinosaur dung, it doesn't look like your typical fossil dung that you'll find in museums. Most of that is rather, sausage shaped, or looks quite a bit like dog droppings. So we had to find other ways to determine that this indeed is fossil dung.
On the vast Montana plains where Karen conducts fieldwork, it is not as though she has to watch where she steps. 100-million-year-old dung is as difficult to find as it is to identify. But considering the gigantic proportions of some dinosaurs, Karen received help from creatures much smaller than she ever expected. Dung beetles have been around for more than 200 million years, surviving then off the dung of dinos, just as they do off the droppings of mammals today. The beetles excavated through fresh dung, creating an underground network of tunnels. Each new tunnel was later filled in by sediment, leaving the dung full of vertical tubes of different materials.
What they would do is stuff dung down into the sediment and lay an egg right in that dung. And the young grubs, when they hatch out, would have plenty to eat in those provisioned burrows.
Dinosaur dung is known as a trace fossil. It leaves no direct clues as to who left it, but there is plenty of circumstantial evidence. The first clue lay scattered around Karen's study site in the shadows of the Rockies. Thousands of pieces of bone, all from the same creature, a duck-billed dinosaur called Maiasaura. The second clue also pointed to Maiasaura. The dung was full of very finely chewed fibrous material, which could easily have been produced by the battery of grinding teeth in the mouth of a duck-billed dinosaur. The final clue was the size of the droppings. Most fossilized dinosaur dung has shattered over the years under the impact of the weather. But by carefully putting these pieces back together, Karen calculates the average size of these droppings as the equivalent of 6 quarts, or 1.5 gallons of dung.
So you can imagine that the dinosaur that produced this massive fecal material must have been a fairly good-sized dinosaur. And the Maiasaura was approximately 24 feet long and was certainly capable of producing quite a bit of dung.
Studying trace fossils, like dung, can provide information not available in other fossils. Karen believes that the answer to one of paleontology's greatest mysteries has come right out of the dinosaurs themselves.
In the piece of probable T-Rex dung, we found bits and pieces of bone. And by examining these pieces of bone, we were able to tell that these were actually pieces of dinosaur bone. So this is really exciting information, because for years and years and years, we've been speculating what these large carnivorous dinosaurs were feeding on. But now we actually have direct evidence by looking at the dung that tyrannosaurs did actually feed on other dinosaurs.
All over the globe, scientists are beginning to reconstruct a much better picture of life millions of years ago. Clues to dinosaur behavior keep popping up in some of the most unlikely places. What they ate and why tells us a lot about their daily routines. Almost as if we had found a sauropod's appointment book, giving us a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-at-a-glance view of the likes and dislikes of these remarkable creatures.